The Americans. Chapter 18, America Claims an Empire. Section 3, Acquiring New Lands. When Puerto Rico became part of the United States after the Spanish-American War, many Puerto Ricans feared that the United States would not give them the measure of self-rule that they had gained under the Spanish. Puerto Rican statesman and publisher Luis Muñoz Rivera was one of the most vocal advocates of Puerto Rican self-rule. Between 1900 and 1916, he lived primarily in the United States and continually worked for the independence of his homeland. Finally, in 1916, the U.S. Congress, facing possible war in Europe and wishing to settle the issue of Puerto Rico, invited Muñoz Rivera to speak. On May 5, 1916, Muñoz Rivera stood before the U.S. House of Representatives to discuss the future of Puerto Rico. A personal voice, Luis Muñoz Rivera. You, citizens of the free fatherland, with its own laws, its own institutions, and its own flag, can appreciate the unhappiness of the small and solitary people that must await its laws from your authority. When you acquire the certainty that you can found in Puerto Rico a republic that founded in Cuba and Panama, give us our independence, and you will stand before humanity as a great creator of new nationalities and a great liberator of oppressed peoples. Muñoz Rivera returned to Puerto Rico, where he died in November 1916. 3 months later, the United States made Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens. Part 1. Ruling Puerto Rico. Not all Puerto Ricans wanted independence, as Muñoz Rivera did. Some wanted statehood, while still others hoped for some measure of local self-government as an American territory. As a result, the United States gave Puerto Ricans no promises regarding independence after the Spanish-American War. Military rule. During the Spanish-American War, United States forces under General Nelson A. Miles occupied the island. As his soldiers took control, General Miles issued a statement assuring Puerto Ricans that the Americans were there to bring you protection, not only to yourselves, but to your property, to promote your prosperity, and to bestow upon you the immunities and blessings of the liberal institutions of our government. For the time being, Puerto Rico would be controlled by the military until Congress decided otherwise. Return to civil government. Although many Puerto Ricans had dreams of independence or statehood, the United States had different plans for the island's future. Puerto Rico was strategically important to the United States, both for maintaining a U.S. presence in the Caribbean and for protecting a future canal that American leaders wanted to build across the Isthmus of Panama. In 1900, Congress passed the Foraker Act, which ended military rule and set up a civil government. The act gave the President of the United States the power to appoint Puerto Rico's governor and members of the upper house of its legislature. Puerto Ricans could elect only members of the legislature's lower house. In 1901, in the insular cases, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution did not automatically apply to people in acquired territories. Congress, however, retained the right to extend U.S. citizenship, and it granted that right to Puerto Ricans in 1917. It also gave them the right to elect both houses of their legislature. Part 2. Cuba and the United States. When the United States declared war against Spain in 1898, it recognized Cuba's independence from Spain. It also passed the Teller Amendment, which stated that the United States had no intention of taking over any part of Cuba. The Treaty of Paris, which ended the war, further guaranteed Cuba the independence that its nationalist leaders had been demanding for years. American soldiers. Though officially independent, Cuba was occupied by American troops when the war ended. José Martí, The Cuban patriot who had led the movement for independence from Spain had feared that the United States would merely replace Spain and dominate Cuban politics. In some ways, Martí's prediction came true. Under American occupation, the same officials who had served Spain remained in office. Cubans who protested this policy were imprisoned or exiled. On the other hand, the American military government provided food and clothing for thousands of families, helped farmers put land back into cultivation, and organized elementary schools. Through improvement of sanitation and medical research, the military government helped eliminate yellow fever, a disease that had killed hundreds of Cubans each year. Platt Amendment. In 1900, the newly formed Cuban government wrote a constitution for an independent Cuba. The constitution, however, did not specify the relationship between Cuba and the United States. Consequently, in 1901, the United States insisted that Cuba add to its constitution several provisions known as the Platt Amendment, stating that Cuba could not make treaties that might limit its independence or permit a foreign power to control any part of its territory. The United States reserved the right to intervene in Cuba. Cuba was not to go into debt that its government could not repay. The United States could buy or lease land on the island for naval stations and refueling stations. The United States made it clear that its army would not withdraw until Cuba adopted the Platt Amendment. In response, a torchlight procession marched on the residence of Governor General Leonard Wood in protest. Some protesters even called for a return to arms to defend their national honor against this American insult. The U.S. government stood firm, though, and Cubans reluctantly ratified the new Constitution. In 1903, the Platt Amendment became part of a treaty between the two nations, and it remained in effect for 31 years. Under the terms of the treaty, Cuba became a U.S. protectorate, a country whose affairs are partially controlled by a stronger power, protecting American business interests. The most important reason for the United States to maintain a strong political presence in Cuba was to protect American businesses that had invested in the island's sugar, tobacco, and mining industries, as well as in its railroads and public utilities. Though many business people were convinced that annexing and imposing colonial rule on new territories was necessary to protect American business interests, some were concerned about colonial entanglements. The industrialist Andrew Carnegie argued against the taking of nations as colonies. A personal voice, Andrew Carnegie. The exports of the United States this year, 1898, are greater than those of any other nation in the world. Even Britain's exports are less, yet Britain possesses 100 colonies scattered over all the world. In fact, that the United States has none does not prevent her products and manufactures from invading all parts of the world in competition with those of Britain. Despite such concerns, the U.S. State Department continued to push for control of its Latin American neighbors. In the years to come, the United States would intervene time and again in the affairs of other nations in the Western Hemisphere. Part 3. Filipinos rebel. In the Philippines, Filipinos reacted with outrage to the Treaty of Paris, which called for an American annexation of the Philippines. The rebel leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, believed that the United States had promised independence. When he and his followers learned the terms of the treaty, they vowed to fight for freedom. Philippine-American War. In February 1899, the Filipinos, led by Aguinaldo, rose in revolt. The United States assumed almost the same role that Spain had played, imposing its authority on a colony that was fighting for freedom. When Aguinaldo turned to guerrilla tactics, the United States forced Filipinos to live in designated zones, where poor sanitation, starvation, and disease killed thousands. This was the very same practice that Americans had condemned Spain for using in Cuba. During the occupation, white American soldiers looked on the Filipinos as inferiors, However, many of the 70,000 U.S. troops sent to the Philippines were African Americans. When African American newspapers questioned why blacks were helping to spread racial prejudice to the Philippines, some African American soldiers deserted to the Filipino side and developed bonds of friendship with the Filipinos. It took the Americans nearly 3 years to put down the rebellion. About 20,000 Filipino rebels died fighting for independence. The war claimed 4,000 American lives and cost $400 million, 20 times the price the United States had paid to purchase the islands. Aftermath of the war. After suppressing the rebellion, the United States set up a government similar to the one it had established for Puerto Rico. The U.S. president could appoint a governor, who would then appoint the upper house of the legislature. Filipinos would elect the lower house. Under American rule, the Philippines moved gradually towards independence and finally became an independent republic on July 4, 1946. Part 4. Foreign Influence in China. U.S. imperialists saw the Philippines as a gateway to the rest of Asia, particularly to China. China was seen as a vast potential market for American products. It also presented American investors with new opportunities for large-scale railroad construction. Weakened by war and foreign intervention, China had become known as the sick man of Asia. France, Germany, Britain, Japan, and Russia had established prosperous settlements along the coasts of China. They also had carved out spheres of influence, areas where each nation claimed special rights and economic privileges. John Hay's Open Door notes, the United States began to fear that China would be carved into colonies and American traders would be shut out. To protect American interests, U.S. Secretary of State John Hay issued in 1899 a series of policy statements called the Open Door Notes. These notes were letters addressed to the leaders of imperialist nations, proposing that the nations share their trading rights with the United States, thus creating an open door. This meant that no single nation would have a monopoly on trade with any part of China. The other imperialist powers reluctantly accepted this policy. The Boxer Rebellion in China. Although China kept its freedom, Europeans dominated most of China's large cities. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, as some Chinese formed secret societies pledged to rid the country of foreign devils. The most famous of these secret groups were the Boxers, so named by Westerners because members practiced martial arts. The Boxers killed hundreds of missionaries and other foreigners, as well as Chinese converts to Christianity. In August 1900, troops from Britain, France, Germany, and Japan joined about 2,500 American soldiers and marched on the Chinese capital. Within 2 months, the international forces put down the Boxer Rebellion. Thousands of Chinese people died during the fighting. Protecting American rights. After the Boxer Rebellion, the United States feared that European nations would use their victory to take an even greater control of China. To prevent this, John Hay issued a second series of open-door notes, announcing that the United States would safeguard for the world the principle of equal and impartial trade with all parts of the Chinese Empire. This policy paved the way for greater American influence in Asia. The open-door policy reflected the deeply held American beliefs about the United States industrial capitalist economy. First, Americans believed that the growth of the U.S. economy depended on exports. Second, they felt the United States had a right to intervene abroad to keep foreign markets open. Third, they feared that the closing of an area to American products, citizens, or ideas threatened the U.S.'s survival. These beliefs became the bedrock of American foreign policy. Part 5. Impact of U.S. territorial gains. In 1900, Republican William McKinley, a reluctant but confirmed imperialist, was elected to a second term against Democrat William Jennings Bryan, who staunchly opposed imperialism. McKinley's re-election confirmed that a majority of Americans favored his policies. Under McKinley, the United States had gained an empire. Even before McKinley was re-elected, The Anti-Imperialist League had sprung into being. The League included some of the most prominent people in America, such as former President Grover Cleveland, industrial leader Andrew Carnegie, and social worker Jane Addams, and many leading writers. Anti-imperialists had different and sometimes conflicting reasons for their opposition, but all agreed that it was wrong for the United States to rule other people without their consent. The novelist Mark Twain questioned the motives for imperialism in a satirical piece written in 1901. A personal voice, Mark Twain. We shall go on conferring on our civilization upon the peoples that sit in darkness, or shall we give those poor things a rest? Extending the blessings of civilization to our brother who sits in darkness has not been a good trade and has been a good trade and has paid well on the whole, and there is money in it yet, but not enough in my judgment to make any considerable risk advisable. As a novelist, Twain had a great influence on American culture, but little influence on foreign policy. In the early 20th century, the United States under President Theodore Roosevelt and President Woodrow Wilson would continue to exert its power around the globe.